Welcome, friends, to another gentle tale from the Chestnut Hollow Journal. Today we return to the cozy woods, where small creatures go about their quiet days in warmth and wonder. Find yourself a comfortable spot, perhaps a warm drink by your side, and let's step together into the peaceful world of Chestnut Hollow. Tales of the Woodland Friends. The river wound lazily through the woods, its glassy surface catching dappled sunlight that fell through willows, alders, and hazel thickets. On warm mornings like this, the riverbank became the favorite haunt of Mole, who liked nothing better than to sit at the water's edge and let his paws trail in the cool current. His stone cottage, tucked under the roots of a giant beech tree, was close enough that he could smell the faint scent of baking bread drifting from his oven as he prepared a loaf for the afternoon. Mole was not alone this morning. On the opposite bank, Badger emerged from a hollow oak, tugging at the straps of a sturdy basket filled with practical things: bread heels, boiled eggs, and a small jar of butter. Badger never fussed with frills, but he had an eye for wholesome food. "Morning, Mole," he called, his deep voice echoing across the water. "River's slow today. Fancy a row?" A rustle from the reeds announced the arrival of Mouse, neat and sprightly in his little checked shirt. He carried a clutch of wild mint tied in twine, the fresh green scent filling the air. "I thought we might try mint tea with honey," Mouse suggested, climbing into the blue-painted rowboat that rested against the pier. "It's so refreshing in the summer." The three friends met midstream, Badger steady at the oars, Mole gazing dreamily at the reflections, and Mouse fussing about with cups and cloths. The riverbank unfolded in gentle shades of green. Clusters of forget-me-nots, stands of reeds, and dragonflies that glittered like shards of blue glass. Their boat drifted toward a sunny meadow where tall grasses bent in the breeze. They set up a cloth beneath a leaning willow, unpacking bread, eggs, cheese, and a crock of golden butter. Mole tore bread into thick slices, spreading butter until it melted into the warm crumb. "Simple food is always the best," he sighed contentedly. After their meal, they lay on their backs watching clouds. One cloud looked remarkably like Hedgehog in her red dress, bustling about with baskets of berries. "Do you suppose she's baking again today?" Mole asked. "I could smell something sweet on the air earlier." "Likely blackberry tart," Mouse murmured, half asleep. "She'll be cross if we arrive empty-pawed." So they resolved to gather something on the way home. Wild strawberries, perhaps, or handfuls of fresh mint from the riverbank. The day stretched gently ahead, promising small errands, quiet laughter, and the comfort of friendship. Hedgehog's cottage nestled against a sunny slope, the roof thick with moss and wild thyme. Smoke drifted from the chimney, carrying the unmistakable aroma of pastry. By the time Mole, Mouse, and Badger arrived with their bundles of mint and berries, the kitchen windows were steamed up with warmth. Inside, Hedgehog stood at her wooden table, flour dusting her nose and paws. She was rolling pastry as neat as lace, humming to herself. "Oh, good you've come," she exclaimed. "I've made more than enough tart, but I'll need help finishing it." The table was already crowded with delights: a bowl of sugared gooseberries, a jug of cream cool from Spring House, and a loaf of golden-crusted bread. The tart itself was cooling on the sill, its dark purple filling bubbling gently under the crust. Hedgehog fussed about, cutting slices, pouring cream, and ensuring each plate was filled. They ate by the open window, daisies nodding in the breeze outside. Mouse spooned cream onto his tart, declaring it the very taste of summer. Mole, less elegant, licked purple stains from his whiskers. Badger ate in silence, but his satisfied nod was praise enough. After tea, they set about tidying. Hedgehog, never idle, handed out tasks: Mole to sweep the crumbs, Mouse to wash the dishes, and Badger to fetch more firewood from the stack outside. "There's comfort in order," she said firmly. though her eyes twinkled at their mock complaints. As the sun sank, they lingered on the grassy slope, full and happy. The meadow hummed with bees and the distant call of a cuckoo. "We ought to plan a walk," Mouse suggested. "Perhaps through the fern glades by the old mill. The air is cooler there." "Tomorrow," Hedgehog agreed, "but no rushing. The woods keep their own pace, and so shall we." The following morning dawned misty, with the air thick with the scent of damp earth and leaves. The friends set off together, Hedgehog in her neat shawl, Mouse bounding ahead, Mole carrying a little satchel with bread and cheese, and Badger steady at the rear with a walking stick. The path wound between tall ferns, their fronds heavy with dew, brushing cool against their fur. The forest here was deeper, older, with towering oaks and beeches that closed overhead, filtering the light into green gold. The mill stream gurgled nearby, leading them onward with its cheerful song. They stopped at a clearing where the ruins of the old mill stood, ivy crawling up its crumbling stone. The water wheel still turned slowly, though no one remembered when it had last ground grain. Moss and foxgloves grew in the crevices, and a family of wrens had made their nest under the eaves. "Perfect spot for luncheon," Mole declared, unpacking the satchel. He laid out cheese, brown bread, radishes crisp from the garden, and a crock of gooseberry jam wrapped in cloth. Mouse spread jam on bread and passed slices around, while Hedgehog sliced radishes paper thin. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint scent of mint from the river. After eating, they wandered through the mill's shadow, marveling at the plants that had claimed the stones. Mouse pointed out tiny ferns unfurling in the cracks, and Badger tapped his stick against the old timbers, testing their soundness. A sturdy place for all its age, he mused. The afternoon passed gently. Mole stretched in the grass, watching the water wheel turn, while Hedgehog gathered herbs growing wild. Woodruff, chickweed, and a few sprigs of meadowsweet. Mouse darted after butterflies, and Badger leaned against a stone wall, pipe in paw, content with the peace of the hour. When it was time to go, the woods seemed to close behind them, as if keeping its secrets. The friends walked home in comfortable silence, each carrying a small treasure, herbs, berries, or simply the memory of a slow, kind day by the river and the mill. The next day, the friends awoke to the steady patter of rain. Not a stormy rain, but the sort that falls softly and without hurry, soaking into moss and leaf until the wood smells sweet and alive. Mole stood at his doorway beneath the beech roots, watching droplets race down the ivy leaves. He tugged on his little brown coat, for he had arranged to meet Mouse and Hedgehog by the fern glade, rain or no rain. Badger, ever practical, arrived at Mole's door with a sturdy umbrella made from stitched-together dock leaves and wax string. "No sense in getting drenched," he grumbled, though he secretly enjoyed the smell of wet earth. The two set off together, boots squelching on the muddy path. At the glade, they found Mouse already busy. He had strung a line between two young birches, over which he draped a patchwork cloth to make a little shelter. Hedgehog, wrapped in her shawl, was setting a small basket down beneath it. "I brought bread rolls," she said, tucking damp strands of fur from her face. "Still warm from the oven, though they'll cool fast in this weather." They huddled beneath the makeshift awning, listening to the dripping of rain on fern fronds as they passed around the rolls. Mole pulled out a jar of honey, thick and amber gold, spreading it generously. The rolls were soft, and the honey dripped down their paws, but none minded. As the rain grew heavier, the glade turned into a wonderland. Ferns bent under the weight of droplets, each frond tipped with tiny beads of light. Puddles mirrored the sky, rippling as frogs plopped in. A family of snails crept slowly across the moss, leaving shining trails behind them. Mouse, curious, sketched their spiraled shells with a little charcoal stick he carried in his pocket notebook. Rainy days have their own sort of magic, Hedgehog said, sipping mint tea from a small flask. It makes us see the woods differently, slower and closer. They lingered there all afternoon, snug in their shelter, until the clouds thinned and the first weak rays of evening sun broke through. The rain left behind a world washed bright and new, and the friends made their way home, damp but content, carrying the memory of honey rolls and dripping ferns. The following week was warm and still, the kind of weather that brought out the scent of every flower in Mole's small garden. His cottage sat partly underground, its round windows peering out at rows of beans, lettuces, and radishes. Beyond the neat beds, a tangle of sweet peas climbed crooked sticks, their pink and purple blossoms glowing in the last light of the day. Mole invited his friends for supper in the garden. He laid a cloth across a low bench made from an old plank, setting out bowls of radishes, crusty bread, and a pot of soft cheese mixed with herbs. Hedgehog arrived with a basket of early strawberries, their red skins glistening, while Mouse carried a jug of cool water flavored with lemon balm. Badger brought a round tin that revealed, to everyone's delight, slices of savory pie filled with carrots and potatoes. They ate as the sun sank, the air growing lavender in the half-light. Fireflies began to wink among the hedges, and a blackbird sang a sweet, winding song from the top of an oak. The woods, so noisy by day, seemed to grow hushed as though it too paused to listen. After supper, the friends lingered among the flowers. Mouse tugged at Mole's paw, eager to show him a nest of baby wrens hidden in the pea tangle. Hedgehog collected a few mint leaves to dry for tea, while Badger settled on the bench with a satisfied sigh, pipe glowing softly in the dark. As night fell, they lit a small lantern on the table, its glow catching the white blossoms of the wild roses climbing the fence. "It feels as if the garden belongs to us and the stars," Mole whispered, half dreaming. They stayed until the crickets began their steady chorus and the lantern burned low, reluctant to leave the peace of the evening. At last, with good nights softly exchanged, each wandered home through paths silvered by moonlight, carrying the taste of strawberries and the sound of the blackbird's song in their hearts. On another morning, bright and clear, the woodland friends decided to run their errands together. There was a small track that wound through the heart of the wood, linking their cottages, and though each had a task of their own, they found it more cheerful to walk in company. Hedgehog kneaded flour from the mill, her baskets swinging as she walked briskly. Mole had to fetch a bundle of kindling from the coppice. Mouse was intent on gathering herbs for his little apothecary, and Badger had promised to help mend the old footbridge that crossed the stream. The track wound past sunlit glades where butterflies danced, and through cool, mossy hollows where the air smelled of damp leaves. They paused at the mill, where the miller, a stout water vole, greeted them with a wave, dusting flour from his fur. Hedgehog's baskets were soon filled, and she tucked in a small extra sack of oats just in case. From there, they walked to the coppice, where stacks of cut branches lay ready. Mole filled his arms with kindling, while Badger carefully tested the planks left for the bridge repair. Mouse darted about, plucking sprigs of thyme and marjoram, storing them in neat bundles tied with twine. At midday, they sat together beneath a tall oak, spreading out their lunches. Hedgehog unwrapped a jar of pickled beets, Badger shared slices of dense brown bread, and Mouse brought out a little wedge of nutty cheese. Mole contributed apples, their skins shiny and red. They ate with gusto, the sun filtering down in shifting patterns. The rest of the day passed in cheerful industry. Badger hammered new planks onto the footbridge while Mole steadied the nails. Hedgehog returned flour to her pantry, tidying with satisfaction, while Mouse hung herbs in bunches to dry from his rafters. By evening, each cottage had the pleasant air of tasks completed and the promise of a quiet supper. As twilight gathered, they met once more, not for errands, but for the simple pleasure of company. They sat on Badger's porch beneath a climbing honeysuckle, sipping tea and nibbling slices of seed cake. The woods hummed with evening insects, and the friends leaned back, grateful for the small, ordinary labors that tied their days together. The woodland creatures rarely ventured far from their cottages, but once every few weeks they took the well-worn track to the village market, where hedgerows met a cluster of wooden stalls under a grand chestnut tree. It was not a fair nor festival, but a quiet, everyday gathering where neighbors exchanged eggs, flour, herbs, or a kind word. On this bright morning, the friends decided to walk together. Hedgehog carried an empty basket lined with cloth, her mind already on flour, dried peas, and a small jar of treacle if she could find one. Mouse brought a pouch of dried thyme and chamomile to trade, while Mole carried a round of cheese wrapped in leaves. Badger, practical as ever, walked with a bundle of kindling tied to his back. Someone always needed wood. The path wound between hawthorn hedges, buzzing with bees. The air smelled of honeysuckle and meadowgrass, and the sound of grasshoppers filled the stillness. Mole walked with his eyes on the sky, pointing out clouds shaped like ships, while Mouse hurried ahead, ears twitching with curiosity. At the market, stalls brimmed with simple bounty. Carrots still dusted with earth, jars of honey glowing amber, and bundles of lavender tied with twine. Hedgehog selected a small sack of flour, tapping it for firmness. Badger exchanged kindling for a tin of nails. Mole bought a jug of buttermilk, cool and heavy, and Mouse bartered herbs for a bundle of soft wool. They paused at a bench under the chestnut tree to share a light meal. Hedgehog produced oat biscuits from her basket. Mole poured buttermilk into cups, and Mouse unwrapped a packet of dried figs. Badger munched in silence, though his whiskers twitched with satisfaction. The walk home was slower, their baskets heavier, but their spirits lighter. Each step along the shady lane seemed threaded with comfort. The hum of bees, the weight of useful goods, and the warm company of friends whose errands had become shared adventure. 2 days later, Badger's new planks for the stream bridge needed testing. The stream itself was not wide, but after heavy rain, its waters tumbled with froth and foam. Mole eyed it nervously, for he disliked rushing water. The four friends set off in the morning, carrying a small satchel of bread, cheese, and gooseberries for lunch. The woods grew denser near the stream, with alders leaning across the water and roots twisting into the banks. When they reached the bridge, the sunlight flashed silver on the rippling current. Badger inspected the planks, firm and straight across the posts he had hammered in days before. Strong as an oak, he declared, and stepped onto the bridge. Hedgehog followed confidently, while Mouse skipped across nimbly, tail flicking. Mole hesitated. "Go on, Mole," said Hedgehog gently. "The bridge is steady. We'll be right here." Mole breathed deep and shuffled forward. The planks held, the water rushed beneath, and step by step he reached the far side. Mouse clapped, Hedgehog smiled warmly, and even Badger gave a proud grunt. "See? A fine crossing." They settled on the far bank for lunch. The stream sang over stones, and dragonflies flickered above the surface. Mouse peeled gooseberries and sprinkled them with sugar from a tiny paper twist, while Mole spread cheese on brown bread. Hedgehog poured tea from a flask, and Badger leaned back, pipe in paw, content. The day ended with the bridge declared sound and serviceable. But more than that, Mole carried home the quiet pride of having crossed it. The woods seemed broader to him now, as though the far bank belonged to them all. Late summer came, and with it brambles heavy with fruit. The hedgerows turned dark with shining clusters of blackberries, sweet and tart all at once. Hedgehog announced that her pantry needed filling, and so the four friends set out with baskets and pails. The sun was warm, and the hedges hummed with bees. Mole found the lowest berries, sweet and soft, while Mouse scrambled nimbly to reach the higher ones. Badger, steady and tall, pulled back thorny branches so Hedgehog could pick without pricking her paws. Soon their baskets filled with glossy fruit, and their muzzles were stained purple. They paused in a meadow to rest, laying out bread and cheese once more. Hedgehog produced a little jar of clotted cream, and with laughter they piled berries high upon their slices, turning simple fare into a feast. As the day wore on, their baskets grew heavy. They spoke of what would be made from the harvest: Hedgehog's famous blackberry tarts, Mouse's syrup for winter coughs, Badger's jars of jam lined up neatly in the larder, and Mole's pies to share at his beechroot cottage. The walk home was slow and sweet, their paws sticky, their hearts content. The woods glowed with the late summer sun, shadows stretching long across the path. At each doorstep, they parted with cheerful waves, already dreaming of the scent of bubbling fruit and pastry that would soon fill their kitchens. The blackberry baskets were not wasted. Hedgehog spent the following days in her cool stone kitchen, stewing fruit in a large copper pot until the air was heavy with its rich, sweet scent. The others came and went, helping where they could, Mouse tying neat paper lids, Mole washing jars in hot water, and Badger carrying heavy crates to the pantry shelves. By the end of the week, rows of shining jars stood in orderly lines, their contents ranging from jam to chutney, each labeled in Hedgehog's tidy hand. "Enough to last through winter," she declared, paws on hips, though her eyes softened with pride. That evening, the friends sat down to a simple supper in her kitchen: bread, a wedge of sharp cheese, and fresh jam spread thick across the slices. The little room glowed with candlelight, shadows dancing on the beams overhead. Mole licked a streak of jam from his paw, and Mouse declared the batch the finest yet. Badger, as always, said little, but he returned home with a jar tucked securely in his coat pocket. Hedgehog smiled to herself, watching the shelves gleam in the lamplight. It wasn't just food she had stored away, but the memory of summer days gathered in jars. September drifted in gently, with cooler breezes rustling through the tall oaks. On one such morning, the friends set off to the orchard on the edge of the wood, a place where old apple trees leaned like kindly giants, their branches heavy with fruit. The grass beneath was littered with windfalls, red, green, and golden apples lying soft in the dew. Mole gathered the sound ones into a sack, while Mouse clambered up low branches to pick the shiniest fruit. Hedgehog tested each apple with a careful paw, selecting only the firmest for storing. Badger, meanwhile, shook the boughs with his strength, laughing gruffly as apples rained down. They ate as they worked, their teeth crunching into sweet, tart flesh, juice dripping onto their paws. Hedgehog suggested baking pies and drying slices for the winter, while Mouse grew dreamy about cider simmering with spices. At midday, they laid out bread and butter on a check cloth beneath a gnarled pear tree. Hedgehog added sliced apples to the spread, and Mouse produced a tiny pot of honey. Badger cut thick chunks of bread, Mole handed around fruit, and the orchard hummed quietly with bees. When the baskets were full, they returned home in slow procession, the sun setting low and golden. The smell of apples clung to their fur, and the promise of pies and puddings filled their thoughts with quiet delight. Not every day held errands or journeys. Some evenings were best spent in stillness. At Mole's cottage, the friends often gathered when the nights grew cooler. His beechroot dwelling was snug, with its round windows, stone hearth, and shelves filled with odd treasures: smooth pebbles, feathers, and the occasional shiny button. On one such evening, a fire crackled in the hearth, the room glowing with warmth. Hedgehog sat knitting by the light, her needles clicking softly. Mouse perched on a stool, bent over a sketch of the orchard trees. Badger reclined in a chair that creaked under his weight, pipe sending curls of smoke toward the rafters. Mole, happiest of all, set out a small supper: brown bread, butter, and a single pie baked from the first apples. They ate slowly, talking in low voices about the turn of the season, about the work to be done before winter, and about nothing at all. Outside, wind rustled the leaves, but inside all was safe and still. When the fire burned low, they lingered, reluctant to part. Hedgehog folded her knitting, Mouse packed his pencils, and Badger stretched mightily before standing. They left Mole's cottage one by one, their paws crunching on fallen leaves, the air cool and fragrant with wood smoke. Mole watched them go, heart full, before shutting his round little door. The embers glowed warmly behind him, as if keeping watch over their friendship until morning. The blackberry harvest was the talk of the little woodland dwellings for many days after the picking. Hedgehog, ever the most industrious of the four friends, had declared that the time had come to put the summer in jars before the weather turned. And so her kitchen became the heart of activity, a warm, fragrant space where bubbling pots and careful hands transformed baskets of glossy fruit into jam, preserves, and even a deep chutney scented with cloves. Her cottage, nestled against a sunlit slope, always smelled pleasant, but during these days the sweetness carried as far as the lane. Passers-by would lift their noses appreciatively, whispering, "That hedgehog has her hands full again." Inside, flour dusted the air like mist, and a large copper pan bubbled gently on the stove. Mole, Mouse, and Badger had been pressed into service, though not one of them complained. Mole had the honorable job of washing jars. He hummed softly as he dunked glass into hot water, polishing them dry until they sparkled. He liked the rhythm of the task, the way the jars clinked against one another, and he imagined how they would look lined up in neat rows on the pantry shelf. Mouse, smaller and quicker, darted about with strips of brown paper and twine, tying lids and making tidy bows. He paused now and then to write small labels in his careful hand. Blackberry jam, late summer. Badger's strength was needed for the heavier work. He carried baskets in and out, lugged sacks of sugar, and even chopped log for the stove when the fire burned too low. Though he grumbled, as was his habit, there was pride in his eyes each time Hedgehog praised his steady paws. By afternoon, the kitchen glowed with more than firelight. Steam clouded the windows, and the scent of sugar and fruit seemed to seep into their fur. Hedgehog herself moved from stove to table and back again with quiet authority, testing the jam on cold plates, stirring with her broad spoon. Her shawl sleeves rolled above her elbows. "Not yet," she would murmur, peering into the pan. Patience is the secret. At last, the jam set to her satisfaction, and the friends filled jar after jar. Hedgehog held one up, the deep purple shining like a jewel in the lamplight. "Summer itself," she said softly, and for a moment all four stood still, breathing in the sweetness. When the work was done, the shelves in her cool stone pantry were laden with treasure: rows of jam, chutney, bottled fruit, and jars of cordial. The sight filled them with quiet triumph. Hedgehog wiped her paws on her apron, a tired but happy smile on her face. "We've done a good job," she said, though they all knew most of the labor had been hers. To celebrate, she insisted they sit down to a simple supper. The kitchen table was soon spread with brown bread, a wedge of sharp cheese, and the first jar opened, its glossy contents spread thick on slices still warm from the oven. Candlelight flickered across their faces as they ate, the crackle of the stove filling the pauses in their conversation. Mole licked a streak of jam from his whiskers. Mouse declared the flavor, a song of brambles and sunshine, and Badger, in his quiet way, cut himself another slice without a word. They lingered long into the evening, talking of apples soon to be gathered, of wood to be chopped for the colder months, of walks they might still take while the days were gentle. Outside, night wrapped the cottage in stillness, but inside it was all warmth, lamplight, and the comfortable rustle of friends at peace with their work. When at last they parted, each carried home a jar as a token of the day. Mole held his carefully against his chest, Mouse swung his lightly from his paw, and Badger tucked his securely into his coat pocket. Hedgehog stood in the doorway, lantern raised, watching them go with fondness. Her pantry was full, her friends' content, and the summer safely stored away in rows of shining glass. And so, as she closed the door and turned down the lamp, Hedgehog thought to herself that the woods gave its gifts so freely, and all one needed to do was cherish them with steady paws, a warm stove, and a heart glad for company. September sunlight slanted soft and golden across the woods, catching on spiderwebs strung between brambles and turning them into threads of silver. The mornings had grown cooler, but the afternoons still held warmth, and it was in such an afternoon that Mole, Hedgehog, Badger, and Mouse decided to walk to the orchard. The orchard lay at the very edge of their woodland, where the trees grew in neat rows, unlike the sprawling oaks and beeches they called home. The apple trees leaned like kindly elders, heavy with fruit, while pears dangled pale and bell-shaped from crooked boughs. The air was filled with the mingled scents of earth, leaves, and ripening apples. Hedgehog, always practical, had brought 2 baskets lined with linen. Mole carried a satchel for windfalls, intending to use them for pies and puddings. Mouse scampered ahead, his eyes darting to every branch, while Badger walked with a steady gait, carrying a small wooden mallet for knocking stubborn apples free. They began their work with cheerful diligence. Hedgehog plucked apples with care, turning each in her paw before deciding whether it should be stored, stewed, or sliced for drying. Mole collected windfalls, polishing the sound ones on his sleeve and setting aside bruised fruit for cider. Mouse scrambled into low branches, nimble and laughing, tugging apples into his little basket until it was nearly as full as himself. Badger shook the trees with good-humored grunts, sending a rain of apples tumbling to the ground. Now and then they paused to eat, crunching into crisp fruit, juice dripping onto their paws. Mole, who adored food of every sort, closed his eyes with bliss at the first bite of a russet apple. "Sweet, yet sharp," he said. Hedgehog sampled a firm green one and nodded with approval. By midday, the baskets were nearly brimming, and they spread a cloth beneath a pear tree to rest. Out came bread, a crock of butter, slices of cheese, and of course fresh apples. Hedgehog added a small pot of honey she had brought, and soon they were spreading butter and honey over bread, topping it with thin slices of pear. Mouse, always inventive, declared it the very finest sandwich yet. The orchard hummed with bees and the occasional call of a thrush. Shadows grew longer as they lingered, full of food and contentment, before setting out again. Their baskets grew heavier, but the weight was pleasant, a promise of pies and puddings, of jars of sauce cooling on pantry shelves. By the time they returned home, the sky had turned lavender, and the first stars were pricking through. Hedgehog's mind was already turning to recipes. Mole dreamed of steaming pies. Mouse thought of drawing the orchard in a sketchbook, and Badger, pipe tucked in his coat, looked forward to sitting by the fire. The day ended with their stores safely stacked in each cottage, apples piled high in bowls, and the orchard left behind with its quiet generosity. Life in the woods often ran on errands, though none were so small that they did not bring a kind of pleasure. One bright morning, the friends set out together on the winding path that connected their cottages to the mill, the brook, and the sunny clearings beyond. Hedgehog carried 2 baskets, one empty for flour, one filled with blackberry jam to be traded. Mole had a bundle of herbs tucked in his satchel, gifts for the miller's wife. Mouse clutched a list of items he hoped to gather: twine, dried peas, and a few sprigs of rosemary. Badger strode with his walking stick, intending to fetch nails and stout string for mending his garden gate. The path was lovely that day, lit by shafts of sunlight filtering through oak leaves. Blackbirds hopped across their way, and the air smelled of warm moss. They paused at a hedgerow to taste early hazelnuts, Hedgehog cracking shells deftly, and then continued until they reached the mill. The miller, a stout water vole, welcomed them cheerfully. Flour dust hung in the air like mist, and the turning wheel creaked as the stream rushed past. Hedgehog filled her basket with flour, the miller adding a small sack of oats for porridge on cool mornings. Mole delivered his herbs, which were received with gratitude. Mouse found his twine, while Badger accepted a tin of nails, slipping a coin across the counter with a grunt. Their errands completed, they lingered by the stream, spreading a cloth upon the grass. Hedgehog had packed oat biscuits and butter. Mouse produced dried figs, Mole brought apples, and Badger cut thick slices of cheese. They ate with relish, watching the water ripple under the wheel. Afterward, they each carried their errands home. Hedgehog bustled about her kitchen, storing flour in its jar. Mole polished apples for a shelf. Mouse tucked his twine neatly in a drawer, and Badger hammered nails into his gate, satisfied when it swung firmly once more. That evening, they gathered at Badger's porch beneath a honeysuckle vine, sipping tea and nibbling seed cake. The woods around them grew dark, but the little group sat content in the glow of lantern light. The air scented with flowers, their errands complete and their hearts light. As September waned, nights grew cooler, and Mole's cottage beneath the beech roots became the favored place for gathering. Its round windows glowed with lamplight, and the hearth crackled cheerfully, drawing the others inside. One such evening, Hedgehog arrived first, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. She settled by the fire, the click of her needles soon filling the room with a steady rhythm. Mouse came next, sketchbook in paw, eager to capture the curve of the hearth and the play of shadows across the shelves. Badger lumbered in last, pipe in paw, nodding to the others before easing into a creaking chair. Mole, happiest of all, set out a small supper. There was bread, a pot of butter, slices of cheese, and one of Hedgehog's apple pies, its crust golden and fragrant. The friends ate slowly, savoring the sweetness, talking in low voices of their day, of apples gathered, of work done in gardens, of plans for storing wood. The fire warmed the room, the lamplight turned the shelves golden, and outside the night rustled with falling leaves. Now and then, Mouse looked up from a sketch to share a laugh. Hedgehog paused her knitting to sip tea, and Badger's pipe glowed softly in the dim light. Mole, sitting among them, felt his heart swell with the comfort of belonging. They lingered long, reluctant to leave the warmth. At last, Hedgehog folded her knitting, Mouse packed his pencils, and Badger rose with a mighty stretch. They stepped into the cool night, stars bright overhead, and each made their way home along leaf-strewn paths. Mole stood at his doorway, lantern in paw, watching them fade into the dark. Then he closed his round little door, the fire's glow waiting behind him, as though friendship itself were nestled there, steady and sure against the coming cold. The first true chill of autumn drifted through the wood, subtle but certain. The mornings were touched with mist, and a rim of silver glistened on every blade of grass. Mole, waking in his snug cottage, pulled his blanket closer and thought immediately of firewood. The hearth that had once seemed unnecessary in summer now promised comfort for the colder days ahead. By mid-morning, the friends had gathered. Badger, who was always the most practical, declared that they should make a day of it, cutting, bundling, and stacking enough wood to last through the dark season. Hedgehog, already wearing her sturdy shawl, carried twine for binding the bundles. Mouse came bouncing along with a small hatchet that looked nearly too large for him, though he swung it with determined pride. Mole, more hesitant with tools, brought baskets for collecting twigs and kindling. They walked to the coppice, where hazel and ash grew thick and straight. The trees had been managed for generations, and the woodland seemed almost to expect the harvest. Golden leaves drifted down as they began their work, the air smelling of resin and damp moss. Badger cut stout logs with steady, powerful strokes. Mole knelt among the roots, gathering fallen branches and stacking them neatly. Mouse darted from pile to pile, chattering cheerfully while Hedgehog tied the bundles tight, her paws surprisingly nimble. Soon the clearing was full of neat stacks, each one a promise of warmth. They paused at midday, sitting on a mossy log to eat bread and cheese. Hedgehog unwrapped a small parcel of apple turnovers, their pastry flaking at every bite. The friends ate eagerly, laughing as crumbs clung to their whiskers. The work seemed lighter afterward, and the afternoon passed in a rhythm of chopping, bundling, and stacking. By the time the sun slipped low, the wood was filled with orderly piles. They carried as much as they could back to their cottages, cheeks flushed from effort, paws sore but hearts satisfied. Badger declared the day well spent. Hedgehog nodded in firm agreement. Mouse swung his little hatchet with a flourish, and Mole, though tired, felt proud of his contribution. That evening, each friend lit their first true autumn fire. Smoke curled up through the chimneys, carrying the scent of wood smoke across the quiet forest. Inside, flames danced warmly, and the little dwellings glowed with a promise. Whatever the winter might bring, they would face it together, which would stack high and friendship deeper still. The wood smoke evenings soon invited another of Hedgehog's ideas. "We must have a proper supper," she announced one morning, bustling about her kitchen with sleeves rolled high. A meal to mark the turning of the season. The others, already accustomed to her sensible declarations, agreed at once. For days, Hedgehog prepared. She borrowed flour from the miller, polished apples until they shone, and simmered vegetables from her garden, carrots, turnips, and leeks. Her kitchen filled with savory scents as she worked, every shelf lined with neat preparations. When the evening arrived, the friends came bundled against the chill. Hedgehog's table was set with care, a clean cloth, polished spoons, and a lantern glowing warmly. Mole brought a loaf of bread still steaming from his oven. Mouse carried a jug of apple cider, and Badger added a wedge of nutty cheese from his larder. The meal began with a thick soup, steaming in earthen bowls. Hedgehog had simmered it all day, and the taste of garden vegetables seemed to warm them from the inside out. Next came baked potatoes, split open and filled with butter, alongside roasted carrots and turnips, golden at the edges. Mole sliced his bread, passing thick slabs around, while Badger cut the cheese into sturdy wedges. Mouse poured the cider, its sharp sweetness bubbling in their cups. The highlight was an apple pie, its crust crisp and sugared, its filling rich with cinnamon. Hedgehog served it proudly, each slice steaming in the cool night air. They ate in cheerful silence at first, the food too fine for words. Only afterward did Mouse declare, with wide eyes, "It tastes like the orchard itself," and Hedgehog blushed with pleasure. They lingered long after the plates were cleared, sipping cider and talking of the weeks to come, of more wood to be gathered, of the last berries to be picked, of the leaves already carpeting the paths. The lantern burned low, and at last they rose, full and content, each thanking Hedgehog in turn. As they walked home beneath the bright harvest moon, their breath clouding in the chill, they felt the deep comfort of a season marked not with grandeur, but with warmth, simple food, and steady company. One morning, the wood was wrapped in fog, so thick it softened every shape and blurred every sound. The friends had arranged to meet for a walk, and though the world looked strange and still, none of them wished to stay indoors. Mole was first out, lantern in paw, its glow turning the mist golden. Hedgehog joined him, her shawl damp with droplets. Mouse appeared next, fur beaded with dew, and Badger emerged last, his great shape looming out of the fog like a tree come to life. They set out together, the path muffled beneath fallen leaves. The woods, so familiar, seemed new in the mist. Branches reached like shadowy arches overhead. Cobwebs shone silver with beads of water, and the air smelled of wet bark. Every sound, dripping water, distant bird calls, seemed hushed and far away. At the brook, they paused. The water flowed silently, its surface hidden beneath swirls of vapor. Mouse leaned over, peering into the haze. "It's as though the world has grown shy," he whispered, and even Badger nodded in agreement. They followed the brook until the mist began to lift, revealing a meadow glistening with dew. The grass sparkled as though strewn with jewels, and mushrooms pushed up in little circles, caps shining wetly. They spread a cloth on the damp ground, their breakfast simple: oat cakes, butter, and a small jar of jam. Hedgehog poured tea from a flask, its steam mingling with the fog. As they ate, the sun slowly burned through, turning the world golden. The meadow grew brighter, birds sang again, and the woods returned to their familiar shapes. But for a little while, they had wandered through a quieter, gentler world. When they finally returned home, damp and a little chilled, each carried the memory of the misty morning close. Mole lit his fire with a smile. Hedgehog hung her shawl to dry. Mouse sharpened his pencils to sketch what he had seen, and Badger sat content, puffing at his pipe. And though the fog had gone, it left behind a feeling that the woods still held endless secrets, waiting quietly to be discovered on another day. One morning, the friends awoke to find the world glimmering as though dusted with silver. Every leaf, every blade of grass, every twig was edged in frost. Mole, peering out of his round window, gasped at the sight. His garden looked as if it had been touched by a painter's brush dipped in white. The air was crisp, each breath turning to cloud. Hedgehog, wrapping her shawl tight, stepped outside and heard the crunch of frozen leaf beneath her paws. Mouse scurried from his doorway, whiskers quivering in delight, while Badger emerged with his sturdy coat buttoned high, smoke curling already from his chimney. They met on the woodland path, their breath puffing in the morning air. "The first frost," Hedgehog said solemnly, though her eyes twinkled. "That means winter is close at paw." They decided to walk together to the meadow, to see how the frost had touched the land. The woods were hushed, the usual damp smells replaced by the sharp scent of cold. Mushrooms shone pale against the dark earth. Ferns lay pressed flat under their frozen coats, and every cobweb stretched between branches glittered like lace. In the meadow, the grass sparkled as if scattered with diamonds. Mole bent down, running a paw gently along the frozen blades. Mouse laughed and darted about, leaving tiny prints in the frost. Hedgehog pointed out a ring of toadstools rimmed with white, while Badger stood still for a long moment, simply taking in the grandeur of it all. They spread a cloth on a low rise, though it was stiff with cold, and shared a simple breakfast: thick slices of bread, a crock of butter, and a jar of blackberry preserve that Hedgehog had made weeks earlier. Badger poured steaming tea from stout flask, and the warmth of it made their paws tingle. They ate slowly, savoring the sharp sweetness of the berries against the buttery bread, watching the frost sparkle in the sunlight. As they sat, the sun climbed higher, and the frost began to soften. Droplets formed, sliding from twigs and dripping into the earth. The meadow lost its glitter, but the memory of that early brightness stayed with them. On the way back, they gathered what they could for their stores: the last of the rose hips, a handful of late mushrooms, and armfuls of kindling loosened by the cold. Hedgehog tucked everything neatly into her basket, Mouse humming a tune as he skipped beside her. Mole thought longingly of pies, while Badger spoke of mending the last gaps in his woodshed before snow should come. That evening, they met at Mole's cottage, where the fire burned bright and the little room was fragrant with wood smoke. Hedgehog had brought roasted chestnuts, their shells cracked and steaming. Mouse had baked small honey biscuits, and Mole set out a pot of tea. Badger arrived with a jug of cider, mellow and warming. They ate and drank, their laughter filling the snug burrow, while outside the frost crept silently over the world again. As the night deepened, they grew quiet, each gazing into the fire. Hedgehog's knitting needles clicked softly, Mouse sketched the curve of the flames, Mole leaned back with a sigh of contentment, and Badger puffed at his pipe. The frost outside might come night after night. Winter might lengthen and deepen, but here, in the circle of their friendship, there was warmth enough to last through any season. And so the woodland, cloaked in silver, settled gently into the turning year. The end. Thank you for joining us in the quiet corners of Chestnut Hollow. If you enjoyed this story and would like to wander with us again, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others who love cozy woodland adventures. Until next time, may your days be gentle and your evenings restful.